Ethel Simmons, a 73-year-old widow, sat by her living room window, her sharp eyes scanning the quiet street of her suburban neighborhood. For decades, Maple Street had embodied the calm and predictability of middle-class life. Lately, however, something has disturbed that peace. Each night, as darkness settled over the neighborhood, a sleek black car would glide quietly down the street, coming to a stop in front of an old abandoned garage at the far end of the block. Behind the wheel was Carter Willis, a wealthy businessman who had once been a respected figure in the community. But now he arrived only under cover of night, his presence shrouded in secrecy. Seated beside him was a young girl in a yellow dress, her small face showing a sadness that seemed out of place on a child so young. As Ethel watched from her window, her curiosity turned to a deeper concern. What was Carter Willis, once known for his generosity, doing in a rundown garage with a child night after night? And why did his appearance, so unexpected in this peaceful neighborhood, send a ripple of unease through the community? Before we dive into this story of hidden truths, resilience, and unexpected courage, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories of mystery and transformation, don't forget to subscribe. Bookmark. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over Maple Street as it filtered through the branches, illuminating the tidy homes that lined the neighborhood. It was an ordinary street in every way. Modest houses with neat lawns, children's bicycles parked in driveways, and the occasional sound of a lawnmower humming in the background. The inhabitants of Maple Street enjoyed a quiet life, each person keeping an eye on their own business, or at least most of them did. From her window on the second floor, Mrs. Ethel Simmons sat watching the goings-on of her small world. Ethel, a 73-year-old widow, had become somewhat of a neighborhood sentinel. Though her hair was silver and her hands trembled slightly as she held her knitting needles, her eyes were still sharp, missing little as they swept over her familiar surroundings. She'd lived here for decades, raised a family here, and outlived her husband, Edgar, who had passed away 3 years prior. Since then, her daily routines had become her world, and from her window seat she could observe the comings and goings of Maple Street with an unmatched dedication. One evening, as the sky turned hues of orange and purple, Ethel noticed something unusual. A sleek, black car, clearly vintage, with lines that spoke of wealth and meticulous care, slowly rolled down the street, catching the fading sunlight in a way that made it shine like polished obsidian. Cars like that didn't belong on Maple Street. They belonged in front of grand mansions or gliding down the boulevards of wealthy districts. Ethel leaned closer to the window, squinting as the car slowed to a crawl. Behind the wheel, she could make out the driver's figure. A man in his mid-30s, she guessed, with a striking presence. Even from a distance, she could see that he wore a crisp, blue suit, sharp as a blade, and his hair was combed back neatly. He was the kind of man who looked like he belonged in a high-rise office building, discussing mergers and acquisitions, not in a quiet, unassuming place like Maple Street. But it wasn't the man who ultimately caught Ethel's attention. It was the young girl beside him. The top of her curly head barely reached above the dashboard, and she wore a bright yellow dress that looked vibrant against the muted colors of the car interior. She was around 7 or 8, Ethel guessed, and the contrast between the two, the sophisticated man in a suit and the little girl with her innocent attire, stirred a curiosity in her. Ethel watched, mesmerized, as the car made its way to the far end of the street. There, in a forgotten corner, was an abandoned garage, an odd sight amid the tidy houses. Its peeling paint and rusted door were reminders of a time long past, and few ever ventured near it. Most people on Maple Street pretended it wasn't even there. Yet this man in his luxury car drove right up to it. As the car approached, the garage door creaked open, revealing a dark, shadowy interior. Slowly the vehicle slid inside, and with a final groan, the door shut, leaving the street as quiet as it had been before. Ethel's knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she watched the scene, a growing unease building in her chest. She couldn't shake the strangeness of it all. Who was this man, and why was he here, visiting a rundown garage with a young girl? There were no explanations that satisfied her. Ethel knew everyone on Maple Street, or so she thought, and no one would ever imagine that a wealthy-looking stranger would frequent such a place, especially at dusk and with a child in tow. The next night, Ethel was at her window again, eyes fixed on the street. Sure enough, as the sun began to set, the black car appeared. It followed the exact same path, gliding down Maple Street and stopping at the garage. The door opened just as it had the night before, and the car disappeared inside, taking the man and the little girl with it. For several nights, Ethel watched this peculiar ritual repeat itself. Every evening, the black car would arrive, always around the same time, and every morning, before the first rays of dawn, it would slip away, vanishing as quietly as it had arrived. The man never greeted anyone, and the girl never left his side. Ethel found herself drawn to the window each night, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. As she observed, she began to notice other details. The man never seemed hurried or agitated. Rather, he exuded a strange, calm intensity. His suit was always pristine, his movements methodical, and his face, though distant, held a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, the girl, always in her yellow dress, had a reserved manner. Her shoulders were often hunched slightly, and her eyes, even from Ethel's limited view, seemed to hold a quiet melancholy. Though they vanished behind the garage door night after night, Ethel couldn't shake the image of the little girl's sad eyes. Something wasn't right, and each passing day intensified her unease. 100 theories swirled in her mind, some rational, others less so. She knew her imagination could sometimes run away with her, especially since she'd had fewer people to talk to in recent years. But there was something about this man and the girl that didn't feel right. It was as if they were hiding from something, or perhaps from someone. One particular evening, as Ethel sat by the window waiting for their arrival, she noticed her heart racing with anticipation. This ritual had become a fixation, and she couldn't explain why. There was no real evidence to support her suspicions, only a gut feeling that urged her to keep watching. Ethel's routine had slowly adjusted to the nightly arrival of the mysterious man and the girl in the yellow dress. She found herself waiting by the window every evening, anticipating the sight of the sleek black car rolling silently down Maple Street. Her knitting, her television and owls, and even her cups of tea all faded into the background as her attention was consumed by this strange new ritual that seemed to upend the quiet order of her world. Each night, as dusk settled in, Ethel would see the car approach with the same eerie precision, pulling up to the abandoned garage at the end of the street. The garage door would creak open, swallowing the vehicle whole, leaving Ethel staring into the shadows that enveloped the car, the man, and the little girl. By now, Ethel had memorized the man's every move, the way he'd glance up and down the street with a quick, searching gaze, and the way his hand would rest lightly on the girl's shoulder as they disappeared together into the darkened building. This routine never varied, not even once, and Ethel's mind spun, trying to piece together what she was witnessing. What kind of man came to a place like this night after night, dressed in a suit that looked freshly pressed? Why would he bring a little girl here, of all places? There was something deliberate about their secrecy, something that hinted at a deeper mystery that Ethel couldn't ignore. As the days passed, Ethel found herself growing restless. She'd spend hours at her window, looking for any clue that might explain this unsettling routine. She wondered if she should mention it to anyone, perhaps one of her neighbors or even her friend Margie, who she called every Friday afternoon. But she hesitated. She knew how it would sound. An old widow, bored and lonely, inventing stories to fill her empty days. She could already picture Margie's chuckle, the polite way she might try to steer the conversation in another direction. No, Ethel told herself, she would keep her observations to herself, at least until she was sure that her suspicions were well-founded. One evening, however, her curiosity grew too strong to ignore. She couldn't bear to watch passively any longer. She wanted answers, something tangible to prove that her concerns were more than just the whims of an old woman's imagination. So she took a bold step. She decided to venture outside just as the black car was due to arrive. Ethel dressed warmly, slipping on her thickest cardigan and wrapping a scarf around her neck. She could feel her pulse quicken as she moved toward her front door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. After all, she told herself she was only going for a W, and there was a K, and there was nothing unusual about that. With one last glance around her empty living room, she stepped out into the crisp evening air. The chill of autumn had settled over Maple Street, and a faint mist hung in the air, giving everything a hazy, dreamlike quality. Ethel moved slowly, keeping her eyes on the road as she made her way toward the end of the block, her footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. She walked with purpose, though her mind raced with questions and a growing sense of anticipation. As she neared the old garage, she heard the unmistakable sound of an engine approaching. She froze, turning her head just in time to see the black car glide down the street toward her. Heart pounding, she quickly stepped into the shadows, pressing herself against a nearby tree, hoping to remain unseen. The car slowed as it neared the garage, coming to a gentle stop just in front of the rusted door. Ethel held her breath, watching intently as the driver's door opened and the man stepped out. Up close, he looked even more imposing than he had from her window. He was tall, with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes that seemed to scan his surroundings with practiced ease. He moved with a kind of controlled energy, like someone who was used to being in charge. Ethel noticed how he glanced around before turning back to the car and opening the passenger door. The little girl emerged, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized yellow dress she wore. Her dark curls bounced as she stepped out of the car, and for a moment Ethel could see her face clearly. There was a sadness in her eyes, something that didn't belong on a child's face. The man placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the garage with a gentle but firm grip. Ethel felt a pang of unease as she watched them. The man's face, usually composed and aloof, softened for a brief moment as he looked at the girl. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw him lean down, speaking to her in a low voice. The girl nodded, her expression a mixture of trust and resignation. It was a tender moment, but it left Ethel with even more questions. As the two of them entered the garage, the door groaned shut behind them, leaving Maple Street silent once again. Ethel lingered in the shadows for a few more minutes, waiting to see if anything else would happen. But the night remained still, and she knew she would get no further answers tonight. With a sigh, she turned and made her way back home, her mind churning with thoughts and theories. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hidden behind the man's calm exterior, some secret he was keeping from the world. And the girl? What was her story? Why did she look so sad, so out of place? Back in her house, Ethel settled into her armchair by the window, her eyes fixed on the garage, even as the night grew darker. She realized with a sinking feeling that she was in too deep now. She couldn't let this go, not when she was so close to understanding. There was something strange happening right on Maple Street, and she was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant spending every evening at her window, watching, waiting, and piecing together the fragments of this growing mystery. The following week brought a steady drizzle of rain to Maple Street, casting a dreary haze over the neighborhood. The damp air made Ethel's joints ache, but it didn't deter her from her nightly vigil. She sat in her usual spot by the window, a knitted blanket draped over her knees, her eyes glued to the street outside. Even though she could barely make out the figures moving in the rain, she knew that the black car would appear, as it always did. Sure enough, as dusk settled in, headlights emerged from the mist, illuminating the rain-soaked street. The car slowed, then parked in its usual spot outside the garage. The door creaked open, and the man stepped out, a large umbrella in his hand. He walked around to the passenger side, shielding the little girl as he helped her out of the car. Together, they made their way into the garage, disappearing from sight as the door closed with a low groan. Ethel watched with a sinking feeling in her chest. The way he moved and the care he took to keep the gear dry were all so deliberate, yet so mysterious. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The man never spoke to anyone on the street, and the girl's expression was always the same. Sad, quiet, almost resigned. It was as though she understood that her life, whatever it entailed, was meant to stay hidden from the world. As the days turned into weeks, Ethel's unease only grew. Her mind raced with questions that had no answers, filling her with a growing sense of dread. The rest of Maple Street went about their business as usual, seemingly oblivious to the strange ritual that played out every night at the old garage. She wondered if anyone else had noticed the man and the girl, or if they were simply too wrapped up in their own lives to care. She was tempted to bring it up with someone, perhaps with her next-door neighbor, Donna, who was always eager for a bit of gossip. But whenever she tried to broach the subject, she hesitated, the words dying on her lips. She didn't want to sound like a paranoid old woman, spinning stories to fill her empty hours. And yet, the weight of what she was witnessing was too much to bear alone. One evening, unable to contain her frustration, Ethel decided to take a more active approach. She knew that waiting by the window wasn't going to get her the answers she wanted, so she made up her mind to confront the man directly. She would go to the garage herself, knock on the door, and ask him what he was doing there with the girl. Surely, if his intentions were innocent, he would have no reason to hide. As night fell, Ethel bundled herself up, pulling on her raincoat and sturdy shoes. Her heart pounded as she made her way down the street, her footsteps muffled by the damp pavement. She felt a strange thrill, a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. This was no longer just about curiosity, it was about protecting the little girl, about making sure that she was safe. When she reached the garage, Ethel hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. She could hear faint voices inside, too muffled to make out any words, but she recognized the tone, low, almost pleading. She took a deep breath and raised her hand, preparing to knock, when suddenly the voices stopped. A heavy silence fell over the garage, as though whoever was inside had sensed her presence. Ethel froze, her heart pounding. For a moment she considered turning back, retreating to the safety of her home. But her resolve held firm. She knocked lightly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. There was a crack, then the door creaked open. Through the gap, Ethel could see the man's face, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. He glanced down the street as if to make sure they were alone before finally turning his attention to her. "Yes?" he said, his voice low and controlled. Ethel took a steadying breath. "I've seen you here every night," she began, her voice softer than she intended. "I see you with the little girl. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." The man's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise flashing across his face before he masked it with a guarded look. "We're fine," he said curtly, as if that were the end of the conversation. But Ethel didn't back down. "I live just down the street," she continued, her gaze steady. "And I've been watching you both for a while now. I couldn't help but notice that. Well, that it seems a bit unusual, you and the girl coming here night after night. People might start to wonder." He clenched his jaw, his gaze flicking toward the shadows around them. "We're not bothering anyone," he replied, his voice tense. "We have our reasons for being here, and they're none of your concern." Ethel felt a surge of indignation. "I understand that," she said, her tone firmer now. "But the girl, she looks so sad. And as a neighbor, I have to say, I'm worried for her." The man's face softened just slightly, his gaze lowering to the ground. For a brief moment, Ethel thought she saw a hint of vulnerability, something raw and real that he kept hidden beneath his composed exterior. But just as quickly, he straightened, his expression hardening once more. "Thank you for your concern," he said, his voice colder this time. "But it's not needed." And with that, he closed the door, the sound reverberating through the night. Ethel stood there, staring at the door, feeling a mixture of frustration and disappointment. She had hoped for a simple answer, a reassurance that the girl was safe and that her concerns were unfounded. Instead, she was left with even more questions, her suspicions deepened by the man's defensive attitude. As she made her way back to her house, Ethel couldn't shake the feeling that she had only scratched the surface of whatever mystery lay behind that door. The man's reaction had been too guarded, too careful. She was certain now that he was hiding something, and that the girl, with her sad eyes and quiet demeanor, was at the center of it all. That night, as she sat by her window once again, Ethel's determination solidified. She didn't know what the man was hiding, but she was sure of one thing: she wasn't going to stop until she found out the truth. Bookmark, go back. The following morning, Ethel awoke with a sense of purpose. Her encounter with the man at the garage had only intensified her curiosity, and she knew that she couldn't let the matter rest. Still, she needed perspective, and she decided that it was time to share her concerns with someone. If no one else had noticed the strange events unfolding on Maple Street, perhaps she was meant to bring it to their attention. After all, she wasn't alone in this neighborhood. Surely, someone would understand. That afternoon, Ethel attended her weekly knitting circle at the local community center. As she settled into her seat beside Donna, her friend of over 30 years, she decided that this would be the moment to bring up the subject. The room was filled with familiar faces, all of them longtime residents of Maple Street, and their conversation flowed easily around her. Ethel waited for the right pause in the conversation, then leaned a bit closer to Donna. "You know, I've noticed something strange going on down our street," Ethel began in a low voice, hoping to sound casual. She glanced around, making sure she had their attention. "There's this man who's been coming every night, right down to the old garage at the end of Maple. He's always with a little girl, a girl who looks like she'd rather be anywhere else." Donna raised an eyebrow, a faint smile on her lips. "Ethel, you're always noticing things that no one else does," she teased gently. "You'd make quite the detective if you weren't already keeping half the street under surveillance from your window." Ethel smiled faintly, though her expression was serious. "This isn't like that, Donna. I'm telling you, there's something peculiar about it. He brings her there every night without fail. They go inside, and they don't come out until morning. It's like they're hiding from something or someone." Donna glanced around, her expression shifting slightly as she took in Ethel's words. "Well, did you try talking to him?" "I did," Ethel replied, her voice lowering further. "I tried to ask him if everything was all right, but he was evasive. Dismissive, even. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something." Just then, another voice joined the conversation. It was Mrs. Jensen, who had been listening from the other side of the circle. "What's this I hear about a mysterious man?" she asked, her eyes lighting up with interest. "Are we getting ourselves a scandal on Maple Street?" The others chuckled, but Ethel remained resolute. "It's not a scandal, Mrs. Jensen. It's a concern. I worry for the little girl. She doesn't look happy, and the way he hurries her inside each night, it's unsettling." Tom, a retired postal worker known for his dry humor, leaned in with a smirk. "Now, Ethel, you know what they say, rich folks can be a bit eccentric. Maybe he's just trying to keep a low profile. And maybe the girl's his daughter or niece, and they just happen to have an unusual routine. That's no reason to go jumping to conclusions." Ethel looked around, noting the mix of skepticism and amusement in her friends' faces. "But if you'd seen her, you'd understand," she insisted. "I know I sound paranoid, but there's something more going on here. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel right." A young mother named Claire, who was sitting nearby, looked thoughtful. "It sounds strange, Ethel, I'll admit that. But maybe they've had a tough time, or they're going through something personal. And if he's really wealthy like you say, maybe they just don't want people prying into their lives." The conversation shifted, and soon, the group was back to discussing lighter topics: their grandchildren, the latest recipe trends, and the new book for next month's meeting. Ethel listened, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't ignore the quiet dismissal from her friends, nor the gentle hints that perhaps she was making too much of things. The doubts began to creep in as she sat there, knitting absent-mindedly. Was she really just letting her imagination run wild? It was possible, she admitted. Since Edgar's passing, she'd had more free time on her hands, and perhaps she was focusing too much on things that didn't matter. But then she remembered the little girl's face, her sad eyes and quiet demeanor, and Ethel's resolve returned. Whatever her friends thought, she knew what she'd seen, and she couldn't ignore it. As the meeting wrapped up and the women began gathering their things, Donna placed a gentle hand on Ethel's shoulder. "Look, Ethel," she said softly, "I know you're worried, and I know things have been a bit lonely for you lately, but sometimes we can see things that aren't really there. Just keep that in mind." Ethel nodded, giving her friend a faint smile, though her thoughts remained troubled. She appreciated Donna's concern, but she wasn't ready to let go of her suspicions just yet. There was something happening at that garage, something that didn't belong on Maple Street, and she was determined to find out what it was. Later that night, as she sat by her window once more, Ethel replayed the conversation with her friends in her mind. Their skepticism, their dismissive remarks, they all weighed heavily on her. But as she watched the headlights of the black car appear in the distance, she felt her resolve strengthen. Her friends might not understand, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was a reason she'd noticed these things. A reason she was the one who'd seen the sadness in the little girl's eyes. The others could dismiss her concerns, but she wasn't going to ignore them. Not when there was a child involved. Bookmark. The days grew colder as autumn took a firm grip on Maple Street. Ethel continued her nightly vigil, watching the darkened street from her window, her mind swimming with unresolved questions. She had hoped that sharing her concerns would relieve some of her burden, and that maybe one of her friends would take her worries seriously. But after the knitting circle's indifference, she felt even more alone in her pursuit of the truth. It was during one of these quiet evenings that something new happened, something that would shake Ethel's already frayed nerves. Just as she settled into her chair by the window, prepared to watch the now familiar sight of the black car arriving, she noticed an unusual movement down the street. It was faint at first, a flicker of headlights in the distance, but as the vehicle approached, Ethel felt a chill creep over her. This wasn't the sleek black car she'd grown accustomed to. No, this car was even more luxurious, its dark paint glistening under the streetlights and its tinted windows hiding any view of the driver. It rolled down Maple Street with an air of quiet authority, slowing to a stop in front of the old garage. Ethel leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she strained to see who might be inside. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from her distance, Ethel could tell that he was no ordinary visitor. He moved with purpose, his tailored coat and polished shoes a stark contrast to the modest surroundings of Maple Street. Everything about him exuded wealth and power, from the way he carried himself to the way he looked around as though he owned the place. Moments later, the familiar black car appeared, pulling up to the garage just as it always did. The door opened, and the man she'd been watching for weeks stepped out, his face tense. The little girl followed closely behind, her yellow dress standing out in the dim light, and Ethel's heart ached as she saw her shrink back slightly, her gaze lowered to the ground. The two men exchanged a few quiet words, and though Ethel couldn't make out what they were saying, the tension between them was palpable. She watched as the stranger pointed an accusatory finger at the man in the suit, his voice rising just enough for her to catch a faint hint of anger in his tone. The man from the black car, usually so composed and distant, looked visibly shaken, his shoulders slumping as he listened to the other man's tirade. Ethel watched, her heart racing as she tried to understand what she was witnessing. There was no mistaking the hostility in the stranger's posture, the way his hand jabbed through the air as he spoke. She had never seen the man in the black car look vulnerable before, but now, as he stood in front of this imposing figure, he looked almost defeated. The argument lasted only a few minutes, but to Ethel, it felt like an eternity. She held her breath, afraid to move lest she miss something important. The little girl stood silently beside them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression unreadable. Ethel could sense her fear, the way she avoided looking at either man as if she wished she could disappear entirely. Finally, the stranger seemed to finish what he had to say. With a final, pointed gesture, he turned and walked back to his car, his steps measured and deliberate. He climbed inside and the engine roared to life, the sound echoing down the empty street as he sped away, leaving the man and the girl standing alone in front of the garage. Ethel remained at the window, watching as the man stood there, motionless, his head bowed. He seemed lost in thought, or perhaps in despair, and for the first time, Ethel felt a pang of sympathy for him. Whatever was going on, it was clear that he was in trouble, and that the girl was somehow caught in the middle of it all. After a few moments, the man shook himself, as if forcing himself to snap out of his thoughts. He placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder, guiding her back into the garage with a tenderness that surprised Ethel. The garage door closed behind them, and the street fell silent once more. Ethel leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with new questions. Who was the stranger, and why had he confronted the man so angrily? Was he someone from the man's past, someone who knew his secrets? And most importantly, what did this mean for the little girl? As she sat in the dim light of her living room, Ethel felt a growing sense of urgency. She had been right to trust her instincts. There was something dark happening here, something that went far beyond a simple nightly visit to a rundown garage. Her friends could dismiss her concerns all they liked, but she knew that she was witnessing something serious, something that could be dangerous. That night, sleep eluded her entirely. She lay awake, her thoughts circling back to the image of the little girl standing between the two men, her eyes downcast, her small shoulders tense. Ethel couldn't get the image out of her mind, and as dawn broke, she made a silent vow to herself. She wouldn't let this go. She spent the following day in a state of restless anticipation, her mind replaying the events of the previous night, trying to make sense of it all. Every time she thought about giving up, about dismissing it all as none of her business, the memory of the little girl's sad eyes would come rushing back, fueling her determination. Ethel knew that she was in over her head, that this was more than she had bargained for, but she couldn't walk away now. Not when she was so close to understanding. She had to keep watching, to wait for the moment when the truth would reveal itself. The morning after the confrontation, Ethel felt a restless energy bubbling within her. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of the men's argument and the sorrowful face of the little girl. Ethel moved through her morning routine mechanically, her body going through the motions while her mind replayed every detail of what she had seen. That evening, as the streetlights began to flicker to life and cast long shadows over Maple Street, Ethel found herself back at her window, watching and waiting with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. She knew her friends might laugh if they saw her so determined, but her concern for the child had deepened into something more than just curiosity. As she waited, her gaze turned from the abandoned garage to the street beyond, her mind racing with possibilities. She wondered if there was anyone she could turn to for help, someone who would take her concerns seriously, someone who could provide some answers. She briefly considered going to the police, but then dismissed the idea. What would she tell them? That a man and a young girl were staying in an old garage and that she had witnessed a mysterious argument? It wasn't enough. She needed something concrete, something that couldn't be so easily dismissed. Her mind churned with questions. Why would a man like him, clearly wealthy and sophisticated, choose to spend every night in a dilapidated garage? And why bring a child along, hiding her away from the world? The memories of the argument between the two men only heightened her sense of dread. She wondered if the girl was in danger, if she was somehow being used as a pawn in some twisted scheme. Night after night, Ethel resumed her place by the window, her eyes trained on the garage, her heart racing with each appearance of the black car. She noticed small details that she hadn't seen before, like the way the man's shoulders seemed to slump slightly as he exited the vehicle, or how the girl's dress, once bright and new, was beginning to show signs of wear. The little girl's cheerful yellow dress had dulled, and her curls looked slightly unkempt, as if they hadn't been cared for properly. It was one of these nights, in the depth of her thoughts, that Ethel came to a decision. She could no longer bear to just sit and watch, helplessly wondering and worrying. She had to take action to find out the truth for herself. She didn't have a plan yet, but she knew that she couldn't ignore her instincts any longer. She had to be prepared in case something truly dangerous was going on. The next day, Ethel made a conscious effort to be outside when the black car was due to arrive. She carried a small watering can and walked around her garden, pretending to tend to her plants while keeping one eye on the end of the street. She wanted to be ready, to catch any details that might shed light on the man's intentions. As the car approached, she glanced up, trying to appear casual as she observed. But as soon as the man noticed her, his demeanor shifted. He tightened his grip on the little girl's hand, his gaze turning suspicious as he quickly ushered her inside the garage. Ethel noted the way his eyes scanned the street, His expression was guarded and almost fearful. Her mind raced as she returned to her house, closing the door softly behind her. She felt as though she were on the edge of uncovering something significant, something that might explain the tension, the secrecy, the fear that seemed to surround the man and the little girl. But she was still missing a piece of the puzzle, something that would bring it all together. As the days passed, Ethel's vigilance did not go unnoticed. Her neighbors began to notice her increased presence at the window, and she could feel the weight of their curious glances. At first, they simply waved or nodded politely, but soon a few of them began to approach her directly. Mrs. Baker from next door leaned over her fence one morning, a smile on her face. "You've been spending a lot of time by the window lately, Ethel," she commented lightly. "Taking up bird watching?" Ethel smiled politely, brushing off the question with a vague answer. But as more neighbors made similar comments, she felt a growing sense of isolation. She knew they didn't understand, that they thought she was simply being a nosy old woman. And in a way, they were right. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was the only one who could see the danger, the only one who could protect the little girl. One afternoon, as she sat alone in her kitchen, Ethel realized that she had to make a decision. She couldn't continue watching from a distance, feeling helpless as she waited for some kind of resolution that might never come. She had to take matters into her own hands. That evening, Ethel bundled herself up and made her way down to the garage, her heart pounding with each step. She was no longer content to simply observe. She needed answers. She was determined to confront the man, to demand the truth, no matter what it took. As she reached the garage, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. She could hear the faint sound of voices inside, muffled and low, as though they were trying not to be overheard. For a brief moment, Ethel considered turning back. But then she reminded herself of the little girl's sad eyes and weary expression. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. With a steadying breath, Ethel knocked lightly on the door, her heart racing as she waited for a response. The voices inside fell silent, and she heard footsteps approaching. The door opened a crack, and the man's face appeared, his expression wary as he took in her presence. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "Is there something you need?" Ethel looked him in the eye, her voice steady. "I know I'm just a neighbor, and maybe this isn't my business," she began. "But I've been watching you, and I can see that something isn't right. That little girl, she doesn't look happy, and whatever it is you're doing here every night, it doesn't feel safe." The man's eyes flickered, a flash of something almost like guilt crossing his face. He glanced back into the garage, where the girl stood, her gaze fixed on the ground. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "Mrs. Simmons, I appreciate your concern," he said quietly. "But I assure you, everything is under control. There's nothing for you to worry about." Ethel's gaze hardened. "I wish I could believe that," she replied, her voice firm. "But I know what I've seen. I know that there's more going on than you're willing to admit." For a moment, the man simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he nodded. "You're not wrong, Mrs. Simmons," he admitted. "But this is something I have to handle on my own, for the sake of everyone involved." Ethel felt a surge of frustration and sympathy as she looked at him. She could see the weight of whatever he was carrying, the exhaustion etched into his features, but she couldn't ignore her instincts, the feeling that the little girl was at risk. "Then at least tell me this," she said softly. "Is she safe?" The man hesitated, his eyes darkening. "She is as safe as I can make her," he replied, his voice filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. With that, he turned and went back inside, leaving Ethel standing alone in the darkness, more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Ethel returned to her house with her mind racing, replaying every word of her conversation with the man. He hadn't been entirely dismissive this time. In fact, his response had hinted at a struggle he was carrying alone, something fraught and personal. But his answer, vague as it was, did little to ease her concern. She could see his exhaustion, and beneath it, a flicker of fear that only fueled her suspicions. The next evening, Ethel's watchfulness took on a new intensity. This time, she positioned herself in her front yard, pretending to tidy her flower beds as the sun dipped below the horizon. She didn't have to wait long before the familiar black car appeared, its headlights cutting through the dusk as it rolled down Maple Street toward the garage. But tonight, something was different. As the man guided the little girl out of the car, another car approached. This one, coming to a quick stop on the opposite side of the street. A man Ethel had never seen before stepped out. His suit was dark and tailored, and his face wore a hard expression. From the way he moved, confident, with a hint of menace, it was clear that he wasn't here by chance. Ethel's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold. She stayed as still as possible, crouched beside a bush, hoping they wouldn't notice her. The stranger strode across the street and called out to the man, his voice sharp and commanding. "You thought you could just disappear?" the stranger asked, his tone laced with contempt. He was close enough now that Ethel could hear the words clearly. "You owe a lot of people, Carter, people who don't like being ignored." Ethel's breath caught in her throat. Carter, was that the man's name? She hadn't known what to call him, but hearing it spoken aloud somehow made him seem more real, more vulnerable. Carter, the man she'd been watching all these nights, visibly stiffened. He stepped protectively in front of the girl, his jaw clenched as he faced the stranger. "I told you I'd take care of it," Carter replied, his voice steady but strained. "I just need a little more time." "Time?" the stranger sneered, taking a step closer. "Time's up, Carter. You had your chance. Now, either you pay up or we take what's ours." Ethel felt a chill run through her as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just an argument between old acquaintances or business rivals. The way they spoke and the threatening posture of the stranger were things that were far darker. She could sense the danger radiating from the stranger, and it became clear that Carter was trapped in a situation far beyond what she had imagined. "Please," Carter said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "She has nothing to do with this. Just let her go." The stranger laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "Oh, but she has everything to do with this. Do you think you can just hide out in this rundown garage and pretend none of this matters? That you can just keep her safe by running?" At that moment, Ethel felt something inside her snap. She couldn't stand by and watch this any longer. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she stepped forward, clearing her throat loudly to announce her presence. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The stranger whipped around, his eyes narrowing as he took in Ethel's presence. For a moment, he looked ready to brush her off, but then his gaze hardened. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am," he said dismissively. "Go back inside." Ethel stood her ground, raising her chin defiantly. "I think it does concern me, actually," she replied, her voice growing stronger. "This is my neighborhood, and I don't take kindly to strangers coming here and making threats." Carter glanced at her, a mixture of surprise and gratitude in his eyes. He stepped back, urging the girl behind him, keeping a protective arm around her shoulders. The little girl's wide eyes flicked from Ethel to the stranger, her expression frightened but resolute. The stranger turned back to Carter, his eyes narrowing. "You have some nerve, dragging your neighbors into this," he sneered. "But this isn't over, Carter. Not by a long shot." Without another word, the stranger turned and strode back to his car, his movements controlled but seething with anger. He slammed the door and sped off into the night, leaving the street eerily silent. For a long moment, no one moved. Ethel could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, feel the tension still hanging heavy in the air. Finally, she looked over at Carter, who was staring at her with a mixture of gratitude and defeat. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. I didn't expect anyone to stand up for us." Ethel met his gaze, her eyes softening. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing," she replied. "I may not know what's going on, but I can see that you're in trouble. And that little girl, she deserves to be safe." Carter sighed, running a hand through his hair as he looked down at the girl beside him. "I don't know what you think you've seen, Mrs. Simmons," he said slowly, "but I promise you, I'm doing everything I can to protect her. That's all that matters." Ethel nodded, her heart aching as she looked at the child. "I believe you," she said softly, "but it's clear you can't do this alone. Whatever you're dealing with, it's too much for just one person." Carter looked away, his face tightening with frustration. I can't risk getting anyone else involved. It's dangerous, more than you realize. Ethel took a step closer, her voice gentle but firm. Sometimes, Mr. Carter, we don't have a choice. Sometimes we need help, whether we want it or not. He looked at her, his expression conflicted. Ethel could see the weariness in his eyes, the burden he carried alone. She knew he was still hesitant to trust her, but she also sensed that he was beginning to realize that he couldn't keep this up on his own. Finally, Carter gave a reluctant nod. All right, he said quietly, but I'll only tell you what you need to know. I can't risk more than that. Ethel nodded in understanding. That's all I ask, she replied, her voice steady. I'm not here to pry into your business. I just want to make sure that little girl is safe. Carter looked down at the girl, his face softening. He placed a hand on her shoulder, drawing her closer. Her name is Lila, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And she's my responsibility. Whatever happens, I won't let anything happen to her. Ethel nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. She was committed to helping Carter and Lila in whatever way she could. Book go back. The next evening, Ethel found herself back at her window, her heart heavy with the weight of what she'd witnessed. The stranger's threats still echoed in her mind, and her concern for Carter and little Lila had only deepened. She had sensed from his words the previous night that Carter had reached his breaking point. Burdened by secrets he had no choice but to carry alone. As dusk approached, Ethel wrapped herself in a warm shawl and headed out of her house, feeling a sense of resolve that drove her forward. She reached the garage just as Carter's black car pulled up. This time, she didn't wait outside. Instead, she walked up to him as he exited the car, her face set with determination. We need to talk, Carter, she said, meeting his gaze directly. I can see you're doing all you can for Lila, but I also see that you're overwhelmed. I know you're trying to protect her, and I want to help. Carter hesitated, glancing down at Lila, who was standing quietly beside him. After a moment, he nodded, gesturing toward the garage. Let's talk inside, he said, his voice low. Inside, the garage was dimly lit, and Ethel could see that Carter had transformed part of the space into a makeshift living area. There were blankets spread out on a small cot in the corner, a few boxes stacked neatly against the wall, and a small lamp casting a warm, faint glow. She took it all in, feeling a pang of sympathy. This was no place for a child, no matter how well-intentioned Carter's efforts were. Once they were seated, Carter took a deep breath as if preparing himself to reveal something he'd long kept buried. I suppose you deserve to know the truth, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's complicated. Ethel nodded, her hands folded patiently in her lap. I'm listening, she said gently, encouraging him to continue. Carter hesitated, looking down at his hands before finally speaking. I wasn't always like this, he began. A few years ago I had it all. A successful career, a house on the other side of town, and enough money to live comfortably. But I made some mistakes, trusted the wrong people, and made the wrong investments. Slowly, everything fell apart. He paused, and Ethel could see the strain etched into his face, the weight of years of regret and hardship. I was too proud to ask for help, he continued. I thought I could fix things on my own, that I could find a way back to the life I had. But it only got worse. Eventually, I lost everything. My home, my business, even the people I thought were my friends turned their backs on me. Ethel felt a pang of sympathy as she listened. She could see the toll these years had taken on him, the exhaustion and sadness in his eyes. And Lila? She asked softly, glancing over at the little girl, Hop, who was quietly playing with a small doll in the corner of the garage. Carter's face softened as he looked at Lila. She's my niece, he said, his voice thick with emotion. My sister passed away unexpectedly a year ago, and Lila had nowhere else to go. I was the only family she had left, and I knew I couldn't let her end up in the system. He looked back at Ethel, his expression desperate. I've tried to make things work. I wanted to give her a safe, stable life, but it's been hard. The debts I owe, they're not the kind that just disappear. The people I'm indebted to don't care about circumstances or family. They want their money, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it. Ethel nodded, her heart aching as she looked at Lila, who was still absorbed in her play, blissfully unaware of the weight her uncle carried. She could see the fierce love Carter had for her, the lengths he was willing to go to protect her, even if it meant hiding out in a cold, empty garage. "You're doing everything you can," Ethel said softly, her voice filled with empathy. "But hiding here, living in fear, it's no life for either of you. Lila deserves a chance to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere warm." Carter nodded, his face etched with guilt and defeat. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I don't know where else to go. Every time I think we might be safe, they find us again. This garage was my last option, my only chance to stay hidden." Ethel reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You don't have to do this alone, Carter. Let me help you. I know people in this community, people who would be willing to offer support, even if it's just a temporary place to stay. There are ways to get through this, but you need to let others help." Carter looked down as if struggling with the idea of accepting help. "I've been running for so long," he admitted. "I don't even know how to stop." Ethel squeezed his arm gently, her voice firm but kind. "Sometimes, stopping is the only way to move forward. You've done so much to protect Lila, but now it's time to take the next step. Let me help you both find a way out of this." Carter nodded slowly, his expression a mix of hope and fear. For the first time, Ethel saw a glimmer of relief in his eyes, a flicker of gratitude. He looked over at Lila, who had begun to watch them with a curious expression, and Ethel could see the love in his gaze, the determination to give her the life she deserved. "All right," he said finally, his voice trembling with emotion. "If you're sure, if you think there's a way, I'll trust you." Ethel smiled, her heart swelling with relief and resolve. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to do whatever it took to help Carter and Lila find safety and stability. She'd spent so many nights watching, waiting, wondering what was happening behind those doors, and now that she knew, she was more determined than ever to make a difference. That night, Ethel returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. She had a plan forming in her mind, a way to help Carter and Lila find the support they needed. As she prepared for bed, she felt a rare sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. The days of watching from afar were over. She was going to help them build a new life, one where they could find security, warmth, and hope once more. As she drifted off to sleep, Ethel knew that the mystery of the black car and the abandoned garage had been solved, but a new journey had just begun. The following morning, Ethel, her resolve stronger than ever, planned her next steps. She would need resources, allies, and careful planning to help Carter and Lila out of their predicament. She reached out to her old friend, Louise, from the community center, knowing that Louise had connections to various social support groups in town. If anyone could help her pull together a plan, it would be her. When Louise arrived later that afternoon, Ethel filled her in on Carter and Lila's situation. Louise listened closely, nodding as Ethel described the hardships the two had faced. "So they've been hiding out in that cold garage all this time?" Louise murmured, clearly troubled. "That poor child." Ethel nodded. "I know it sounds like they're running from trouble, but Carter's just trying to protect her. He's had a rough time and he's too proud to ask for help." Louise reached over, giving Ethel's hand a comforting squeeze. "You're right to want to help them, Ethel. No one should have to go through that, especially not a child." Together, they made a list of potential resources: temporary housing through the church shelter, clothing donations for Lila, and perhaps even a part-time job for Carter, something to help him start rebuilding his life. Louise agreed to discreetly reach out to her contacts, promising she'd have more information by the next day. The very next evening, Ethel prepared to visit the garage once more. She bundled herself up against the chilly evening air, carrying a small bag of warm clothes she'd gathered from her closet for Lila. She knew it wasn't much, but she hoped it would at least help tide them over until more permanent arrangements could be made. When she reached the garage, she knocked softly on the door. It opened quickly, and Carter's cautious face appeared. He looked slightly surprised to see her, but stepped aside to let her in, his expression a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. Ethel handed him the bag. "I brought some clothes for Lila," she said, her voice gentle, "and I've started reaching out to some people I trust. We might be able to arrange a temporary place for you both, somewhere warm and safe." Carter took the bag, a look of relief passing over his face. He glanced at Lila, who had set aside her doll and was now looking up at Ethel with wide, curious eyes. "I don't know what to say," Carter began, his voice heavy with emotion. "You've already done so much, more than I could have asked for." Ethel shook her head, a small smile on her face. "You don't need to say anything, Carter. You're not alone in this. I know things have been hard, and I know you've been doing everything you can for her. But now it's time to let others help you too." He nodded, and for the first time, she saw him let his guard down. His shoulders, usually so tense, relaxed as he sank onto an old crate beside Lila's cot. He looked exhausted, and Ethel knew that it had been a long time since he'd felt even a sliver of hope. Ethel took a seat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "Louise and I have put together a few resources. There's a local shelter that can provide a warm place to stay, and a friend of mine has some work connections. She might be able to help you find a part-time job." Carter looked down, his hands twisting together. I'd be grateful for that," he murmured. "It's been so hard to find any stability. Every time I think we've settled somewhere safe, it slips away." "And with Lila." His voice trailed off, and he glanced over at Lila, who was now rifling through the clothes Ethel had brought, her face lighting up at the sight of a soft sweater in a cheerful pink. "She deserves better," Carter continued, his voice choked. "She deserves a real home, a real childhood. I'm trying to give that to her, but I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Ethel reached over, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've done so much already," she said gently. "It's clear how much you care about her. Now, let others help you carry the weight. I know it's hard to accept help, but there are people who want to see you and Lila safe." Carter was silent for a long moment, but Ethel could see the conflict in his eyes. Finally, he gave a slight nod, a glimmer of trust breaking through his usual guarded expression. "Thank you," he whispered, barely able to meet her eyes. "For everything. I didn't think anyone would care." Ethel's heart ached at his words, and she shook her head. "You'd be surprised, Carter. Sometimes all it takes is a little kindness and understanding. We all go through hard times, and we all need a little help now and then. There's no shame in that." She looked over at Lila, who was now sitting on her cot, the new pink sweater draped around her small shoulders. The child's face was brighter than Ethel had ever seen it, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth as she hugged the sweater close. As the three of them sat in the quiet garage, Ethel felt a warmth settle over her. They were still far from a solution, but the first step had been taken. She'd found a way to help, and Carter had accepted it. It was a fragile hope, but it was hope nonetheless. The next day, Louise called with good news. The shelter had an opening, and they were more than willing to accommodate Carter and Lila temporarily. Ethel arranged to meet Carter that evening, her heart light with the prospect of getting them to a safer place. When she arrived at the garage, Carter was ready, a small duffel bag packed, and Lila was by his side, clutching her doll. He looked at Ethel with gratitude and a hint of nervousness, as though he were still coming to terms with accepting her help. Ethel placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's just the first step," she assured him. "Once you're settled, we'll look at the job options. For now, just focus on getting comfortable and resting. This is a fresh start." Carter nodded, managing a small smile. He turned to Lila, kneeling down beside her. "We're going somewhere new tonight, okay?" he said gently. "Somewhere warm." Lila nodded, her eyes wide but trusting as she looked between her uncle and Ethel. She took Carter's hand, her small fingers clutching his tightly, and together they stepped out into the evening, leaving the garage and its shadows behind. As they walked toward Ethel's car, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They still had a long road ahead, but they weren't alone anymore. They had found hope, warmth, and the promise of a new beginning, and this time they would have support every step of the way. Bookmark. The air was crisp as Ethel drove Carter and Lila to the community shelter, a modest but welcoming building situated a few blocks away from Maple Street. The shelter was run by volunteers from a local church, a group of kind-hearted people who offered temporary housing, meals, and emotional support to those in need. Ethel had known the volunteers for years and was confident that Carter and Lila would be treated with kindness and respect. As they approached the shelter, Ethel glanced over at Carter. His expression was a mixture of relief and hesitation, his gaze fixed on the building as though he was still coming to terms with this change. He reached over and squeezed Lila's hand, offering her a reassuring smile. Lila, looking uncertain but curious, clutched her doll to her chest, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. They entered the shelter together, greeted by warm smiles and the faint aroma of a homemade dinner being prepared in the kitchen. A volunteer named Susan, a gentle woman with silver hair and kind eyes, welcomed them with open arms, showing Carter and Lila to their room, a small, cozy space furnished with twin beds, a dresser, and a soft rug. It wasn't much, but it was warm, clean, and safe. As they settled in, Ethel could see the relief wash over Carter's face. He set down their bags, running a hand over his face as though releasing the weight he'd carried for so long. Lila climbed onto one of the beds, testing the mattress with a tentative smile before lying back, hugging her doll close. Susan returned with a few additional blankets and a couple of children's books for Lila, her face lighting up as she handed them over. "We're glad to have you both here," she said warmly. "Stay as long as you need. You're in good hands." Ethel nodded, grateful for Susan's kindness, and looked over at Carter. "I'll check in with you tomorrow," she said gently. "Just rest tonight. Take it one day at a time." Carter's gaze softened as he met her eyes, a gratitude that words couldn't fully capture filling his expression. "Thank you, Ethel," he said quietly. I never thought we'd get help like this." She reached over, giving his hand a comforting squeeze. "You deserve it, Carter," she said, "and so does Lila." With that, Ethel left them to settle in, feeling a warmth settle over her as she headed back to her car. Her heart was lighter than it had been in years, knowing she'd been able to make a difference, that she had offered hope to those who needed it most. She knew this was only the beginning, that Carter and Lila had a long journey ahead. But now, they had a foundation, a safe place to call home, if only for a little while. In the days that followed, Carter and Lila began to settle into life at the shelter. The other residents welcomed them warmly, offering companionship and support. Lila made friends with a few children staying at the shelter, her laughter filling the halls as she played, and her spirit finally allowed her to breathe freely. Ethel visited regularly, bringing little treats for Lila, a puzzle here, a small coloring book there, and sitting down to chat with Carter over tea in the shelter's modest kitchen. The change in him was remarkable. Though he still bore the weight of his struggles, his face softened and his posture more relaxed. He spoke with Ethel about his plans and his desire to rebuild a life where Lila could grow up with stability and love. Through Louise's connections, Carter soon secured a part-time job at a local hardware store. The work was steady enough to provide him with a small income, and the manager was understanding of his situation, allowing him the flexibility he needed to take care of Lila. Carter's pride and self-respect began to return, and he held his head a bit higher, no longer burdened by the same fears that had once consumed him. For Lila, the shelter brought new joys. She attended the nearby elementary school, her cheeks flushed with excitement each day as she shared stories of her classmates with Ethel. The other children at the shelter became her playmates, and her once somber expression transformed into one of brightness and wonder. She no longer wore the constant look of worry that Ethel had seen that first night. Instead, she blossomed with a resilience and optimism that only a child could possess. As the weeks turned into months, Carter and Lila's lives slowly took shape. With careful budgeting, Carter was able to save a little each month, planning for the day when he and Lila could move into a place of their own. Ethel and Louise continued to support them, cheering on every small victory and celebrating each milestone. Through their kindness and encouragement, Carter and Lila began to find the security and hope they had once thought impossible. One evening, as the first signs of spring appeared, Carter invited Ethel to a small dinner at the shelter. Lila had insisted on helping him cook, and the two of them proudly presented a simple but delicious meal of roasted vegetables and chicken, a small gesture of gratitude to Ethel for her unwavering support. As they ate together in the shelter's cozy dining area, Ethel looked around at Carter and Lila, her heart swelling with pride. She marveled at how far they'd come, from the cold nights in the garage to the warmth of a community that had embraced them. Carter had transformed from a man weighed down by desperation to someone filled with determination and hope. Lila had blossomed, her once muted laughter now a bright melody that filled the room. As the evening drew to a close, Carter took Ethel's hand, his voice filled with emotion. "None of this would have been possible without you," he said quietly. "You gave us hope when we had none. You helped us find our way back." Ethel smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. "You both deserve every bit of happiness," she replied softly. "You're family now, and families stick together." Lila, sitting beside her, looked up and placed her small hand over Ethel's. "Thank you for being our friend," she whispered, her eyes filled with gratitude and affection. Ethel squeezed her hand, her heart full. "Always, sweetheart," she promised. "I'll always be here for you." As Ethel left the shelter that night, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey had been long, filled with challenges and uncertainty, but it had brought them all to this moment, a place of healing, renewal, and family. She knew she'd found something precious in Carter and Lila, a purpose that had filled the quiet spaces of her life. As she walked down Maple Street under the soft glow of the streetlights, Ethel felt a warmth in her heart, knowing that she had helped bring light to those who had been lost in the shadows. The days of solitude and silent observation were behind her, replaced by a life rich with connection, compassion, and love. The story of Ethel, Carter, and Lila reminds us of the profound impact that empathy, courage, and kindness can have on the lives of others. What started as a mystery, an elderly woman's curiosity about an unusual nightly ritual, became a journey of compassion and friendship. Through her unwavering concern, Ethel helped transform the lives of Carter and Lila, offering them hope and a chance to start anew. Ethel's actions remind us that sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to reach out, to notice, and to care. Her compassion didn't just change Carter and Lila's lives, it also brought meaning and connection to her own. By breaking through her isolation and choosing to help, Ethel found a new purpose and gained an unexpected family. This story also speaks to the strength and resilience found in unity. With the support of her community and her friend Louise, Ethel was able to extend the help Carter needed to rebuild his life and give Lila the warmth of a true home. In a world that often feels disconnected, the story shows us that small acts of kindness and understanding can lead to transformative change. If you found this story inspiring, please let us know by commenting below. If you thought it was good, type 1. And if you thought it was very moving, type 2. We'd love to hear about your own experiences with kindness, compassion, or any similar stories you might have. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss an uplifting story like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and join us on our journey to bring more heartwarming stories to light. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more inspiring tales ahead.